Good evening. I'm Michael Mcguire, Chair of the Department of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. I'm very happy to welcome you to the 34th annual Paul V. McNutt Lecture of the Department of History. We have a wonderful program. I will get out of the way, but I do want to say how glad I am to be welcoming an audience that really is across the country and around the world. It's possible in this age of little boxes to communicate in this way. But in welcoming you, I do want to say that this lecture is very much rooted in place. It is rooted in Bloomington, Indiana. The Bloomington campus of IU is situated on the traditional lands of the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee people. And in this program tonight, it's a reminder that we can be connected from around the world because of IU's location in the place of these people. This is a lecture in honor of Paul V. McNutt, one of the most renowned graduates of Indiana University, a person of remarkable accomplishments for someone of my generation. It is stunning to see, born 45 miles or so north of IU. Paul McNutt graduated from IU in 1913 with an English degree, perhaps one of his few flaws, served in the US military in World War I, received a law degree from IU, became a professor of law, became a full professor of law, was involved in the management of the law school, became a US government official during the New Deal in the 1930s, served the United States abroad representing the United States in the Philippines, the High Commissioner there, not once but twice, was all through that time deeply involved in the development of IU and in the support of IU. And also, a fact not often mentioned about him, toward the end of his career, was the chairman of the board of United Artists Corporation, not otherwise known for its links to the Hoosier. Paul V. McNutt was a complicated person. He's the subject of a wonderful biography by Dean Kotlowski, a graduate of this department's graduate program. I recommend it. It is quite fascinating. For us, a couple of points about Paul V. McNutt that are quite salient. First of all is the ethic of service. Paul McNutt's career really does sum up the variety of ways in which Indiana University graduates are able to serve. Secondly, he is an example of how this university has connected people to the world. He and his close friend Wendell Willkie, friends at IU, did a great deal to think about the relationship of the United States to the world. Some of their ideas are controversial, but the fundamental example that Indiana should have a broad consciousness beyond the state, beyond the country, beyond the world is one of the things that made Paul McNutt matter so much. We remember him in part because his family and because people who admired him have given very freely to the university in his honor. They've endowed this lecture, which is such a basic part of the history department's life. My professional life every day is supported by and made better by the fact that I am the Paul V. McNutt Professor of American History. The McNutt family supports graduate students. It supports other departments. So really, McNutt's legacy of service continues in this way. Very especially pleased with this lecture. History over time has become a more and more inclusive discipline that is open to the whole range of human experience. And the McNutt lectures over these 34 years have testified to that. So it's particularly pleasing, and I think very much in McNutt's idea of what history in the university should do, that I'm happy to bring you tonight's speaker. To do that, I turn to one of my colleagues in the history department, Professor Liza Black.
Hello, everyone. We're so excited you're here. Thank you for joining us. It is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Philip J. Deloria. Deloria is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University. Professor Deloria was the first tenured history professor in Native American and Indigenous Studies at Harvard. Working for several years toward this hire, Daniel Smale, department chair in 2018, described their win of Deloria as tremendous. He called Professor Deloria the complete package, who is hands down the leading authority in Native American history and an incredibly charismatic teacher. His ancestors must surely be proud. Professor Deloria is a descendant of the Dakota Nation. His father is Vine Deloria Jr., author of Custer Died for Your Sins, God is Red, and many others. Professor Deloria shares the same name as his great-grandfather, who was the first Dakota and Christian minister. His great aunt is Ella Cara Deloria, an anthropologist of Dakota culture, and his other great aunt, the artist Mary Sully. Growing up in a powerful mix of politics and academia, Deloria made his way into the professoriate after forays in music, journalism, and teaching. Deloria received the PhD in American Studies from Yale University in 1994, taught for 6 years at the University of Colorado, and then at the University of Michigan from 2001 to 2017, before joining the faculty at Harvard in January 2018. At Michigan, he served as the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, Director of the Program in American Culture, and of the Native American Studies Program, and held the Carol Smith Rosenberg Collegiate Chair. His courses have included American Indian History, Environmental History, the American West, and American Studies Methods, as well as Food Studies, Songwriting, and Big History. Professor Deloria burst onto the academic scene with his first book, Playing Indian, in 1998, a book with a massive impact on American Indian history, taking us into cultural history without taking us back into anthropology. Professor Deloria looked at whites in American Indian disguise as a way into complex and hidden social identities that generated understandings of what it meant to be an American. In his second book, Indians in Unexpected Places, published in 2004, Deloria examined the ideologies surrounding Indian people in the early 20th century and the ways Native Americans challenged them through sports, travel, automobility, and film and musical performance. Professor Deloria then decided to further engage the modern by indigenizing American art in his book, Becoming Mary Sully, in 2019. In thinking through modernism, Deloria concludes she was an anti-primitivist who was looking at the present and the future, using celebrity and pop culture as a way into artistic commentary, much like Andy Warhol, only many decades before his work. Becoming Mary Sully won the 2020 Mary Lynn Kotz Award for Art Historical Writing and the 2020 Donald Fixico Award in Native American History from the Western History Association. In addition to these solo authored books, Deloria co-edited The Blackwell Companion to American Indian History, C.J. Jung and the Sioux Traditions, and American Studies, A User's Guide, which offers a comprehensive treatment of the historiography and methodology of the field of American Studies. Deloria has also written dozens of articles and book chapters, as well as op-eds for The New Yorker. Along with Erica Doss, he is the series editor of Culture America, a University Press of Kansas series focused on American cultural history. Deloria is a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he served for many years as chair of the Repatriation Committee. He is former president of the American Studies Association, an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the recipient of numerous prizes and recognitions, and recently served as president of the Organization of American Historians from 2021 to 2022. Looking ahead, Professor Deloria now reflects upon the relationship between Native American and African American studies. In this vein, he wonders if America has decided to sort through what he calls the original sin of racial slavery, while setting that of settler colonialism aside. His next book will look at these questions through the Lenape meteor shower of 1833. And he will also be publishing a synthesis of American history and a collection of essays, asking us to reimagine our accepted periods of American history. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deloria for his lecture, The Indigenous Constitution, the Greater X, and the Lenape, Putting American Indians in American History.
Thank you so much, Liza, for that incredibly gracious introduction. And thank you, Michael, for the invitation to give the Paul McNutt Lecture. I am incredibly honored to be with you today, even virtually, and to be able to deliver this lecture. Our exchange this evening has a deep thread of resonance for me. As the outgoing president of the Organization of American Historians, which is headquartered there in Bloomington, I've had the opportunity to be in dialogue with the IU History Department for the last few years. And I have a long history with IU's American Studies program and several years of service on the First Nations Leadership Ambassadors Council. But Indiana loomed large for me, even when I was younger, in the person of Raymond J. DeMalley, distinguished professor of anthropology, who was a longtime family friend, an academic mentor, director of Indiana's American Indian Studies Research Institute. And indeed, when I was contemplating graduate school, I submitted only 2 applications, to Yale and to Indiana. And I oftentimes wondered if I'd made the right choice. Because despite being a hardcore Westerner, I've always had strong affective ties to the Midwest. The feel of river humidity, the screaming of insects and the glow of fireflies in the night, the fat air among the trees, the viewscapes of prairie. That all came from childhood visits to my grandmother in Iowa. But it also crystallized for me when my father demanded that I read a book called Rain Tree County by Ross Lockridge Jr. That epic book, The Gone with the Wind of the Midwest, only better in my view, the one that aimed to put Indiana at the heart of the great American novel. Today, it's not hard, for me at least, to think of the synchronicities to be found here. Lockridge wrote much of Rain Tree County while at Harvard. Paul McNutt graduated Harvard Law in 1916. The novel is set on a single day, July 4th, 1892, just a year after McNutt's own birth. And the book is full of Indiana place names evoking the American founding, Henry, Franklin, and my favorite town in the novel, Dan Webster. So I'm going to share my screen. So Lockridge described Rain Tree County as a place with no boundaries in time or space, where lurked musical and strange names and mythical and lost peoples, and which was itself only a name musical and strange. There, he said, it is always summer and the days are long. This move to placelessness and timelessness was ironic, for part of the magic of Lockridge's book lies in its rapturous descriptions of place and of the time of 19th century America and rural Indiana in particular. The lurking cipher in these descriptions, it seems to me, is the ambient presence of native people. In the opening pages, for instance, the hero is named Johnny, Tall One, Shakamak, which is an indigenous name for the Eel River, apparently. And so why give him that name? Interesting. His wife, Esther, has Indian black hair, the result of a native ancestor. His father's healing talents stem from translated native plant medicines. His abandoned town of Dan Webster sits among old Indian mounds. And early on, 5-year-old Johnny is led to narrate a story of American Indians in history. The Indians used to live right around the home place before T.D. and Ellen Shaughnessy had come there in 1820. The Indians were naked and had red skins, and they lived in teepees, and they killed and scalped you with tomahawks. They were marvelous people, and they had lived all over America before the pioneers came and made the stumps. Now, all the Indians had gone out west. And so Native people in Rain Tree County are both present and absent. They linger and they haunt. And in doing so, they illustrate a critical American cultural practice. The physical dispossession of Indian people is triangulated with both a self-shaping memory of these people long gone, right, who suddenly become something like us, Shakamak, and of an erasure of the very possibility of Native lives in the present and future. So for historians, this dynamic has taken shape in the idea of settler colonialism. I'm putting American Progress, a very famous and well-known image that I'm sure you've seen before, up here to sort of let us think about settler colonialism. Unlike the usual kind of colonialism in which colonists take up temporary residence in another country, hoping to extract its resources, create new markets, craft a local political elite, and then return home, say to a retirement villa in East Anglia, well, settler colonists come to stay. They care more about acquiring land than mobilizing labor. They tend to found new political orders, the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa. And as the Australian scholar Patrick Wolf once memorably observed, the dynamic of settlement is necessarily ongoing. It is, he said, a structure, not an event. Well, settler colonialism is a theory, and as such, it seeks not simply to describe, but also to predict. And the future it predicts is of the ongoing erasure of indigenous people, both materially through blood quantum regimes, land taking, and institutionalized violence, and also ideologically through minimalization, stereotyping, tokenism, containment, and vanishing. And so if we take seriously this predictive, structural problem of ongoing erasure, we find that we need to combat it at every turn. And that means that our narrative politics must be self-aware. Because when we are not actively trying to counter this indigenous erasure, it crops up everywhere, like the New York Times race-related page, where amazingly, to my view, an effort to compile stories on race and culture cheerfully composes a racial hierarchy that ignores Native people. Or moments like this, coverage from the last election, or this. Now, if Rick Santorum uttered a sentiment supposedly disallowed in public discourse, he was fired by the selfsame CNN, many of the Americans contesting historical narratives today share his understanding. The 2018 report, Reclaiming Native Truth, framed for us, I think, a new agenda. A full tilt effort at large scale culture change taken up on the field of narrative and story, told by Native artists, writers, and scholars, to be sure, but also by everyone else, including those of us fascinated by American history. Our current crisis rests on the perennial conflict over the narrative politics of American history. What stories get told, how, and in order to convey what lessons. And what stories must be silenced or reduced because perhaps they carry moral obligation that many would prefer not to bear. Does our American pluralism rest on a proliferation of stories or on a few singular narrative lines that organize us into some kind of social coherence? And how might we take up the work of thinking about Indian people in these stories? Well, tonight I want to offer 3 strategies for doing so, because Native American history points us towards unique forms of American pluralism, not simply narrative, but I would argue political in nature. So we can start with the Indigenous Constitution. This simple little 3-article constitution is contained within that of the United States. And it begins with the notorious 3/5 clause, itself a mathematical formula for determining who and how to count. We historians have rightly focused on the North-South compromises that gave us the last phrase of this, 3/5 of all other persons, referring, of course, to enslaved people. Too frequently, however, we miss a chance to point to the only category of people to actually be subtracted from the formula altogether: Indians not taxed. Now, to designate Indians not taxed was to imagine an Indian who was taxed, a person who had renounced their tribal citizenship, been naturalized to the United States, and taken on the responsibilities and the rights of American citizenship, and was thus countable. The effect of the phrase Indians not taxed, which is reaffirmed in the 14th Amendment, was to write Indian people into the Constitution. They are very present in order to write them out of the Constitution. And why? Because Indian tribes were recognized in the American Constitution as distinct sovereign nations. So the second article of the Indigenous Constitution can be found in the Commerce Clause. You'll notice I've highlighted some of the grammatical things. That with rather than among seems to tell the tale. And again, tribal nations are placed, grammatically at least, more on the plane of foreign nations than of states. And because tribes are framed in the Indigenous Constitution as being outside the United States, we can see the importance of the third article, the Supremacy Clause, which reminds us that treaties function among the highest bodies of law in the land. An argument affirmed by John Marshall in 1829. And you can see here his argument, which I've highlighted. A different principle, the treaty is not simply a contract between two nations. Different principles established. Our Constitution declares a treaty to be the law of the land. It is consequently to be regarded in courts of justice as equivalent to an act of the legislature. Now, American imperial and colonial development weakened the American or the Indigenous Constitution, and I would argue with it, the American Constitution. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, Americans pushed to bring Native peoples under American jurisdictional authority, offering them a second-class brand of assimilation that might someday lead to citizenship, tax paying, and maybe even a not unproblematic census category. While Indian tribal nations struggled to maintain their separate status, they were sucked into ambiguous and contradictory relationships with the United States and its constituent state units. And that is exactly the point. In 1831, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, defined this in-between relationship as domestic dependent nationhood. Tribes were reliant upon and subordinate to the federal government while continuing to hold a kind of semi-independent national status. Marshall had second thoughts about his formula the following year, thinking that perhaps one could not write off the Indigenous Constitution quite so easily. The opinion in this case, however, Worcester v. Georgia, didn't really take, and as we know, Andrew Jackson proceeded apace with Indian removal. Worcester v. Georgia was one of the cases that was hopefully a way of sort of stepping aside from Indian removal. Now, what those cases left behind was not some tragic residue. Combined with the Indigenous Constitution, they suggested a new way of framing collective political identities within a pluralistic nation. The US owed Native nations a trust responsibility, even as it recognized an attenuated form of politically distinct sovereign nationhood. Now, many Americans find these things contradictory, and they suggest then that neither can be true. There is no trust obligation, and Indian tribes have no claim to sovereignty. And of course, this is how Indian people disappear. But the reality is that both of these things are true, and they are true under our Constitution and our law. They are true simultaneously. And this creates a novel and important American political structure: federal, state, local, and tribal. Well, the Indigenous Constitution was not doomed. It continues to function today. Witness the surprising outcome of the recent Supreme Court decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma, which recognized treaty-based tribal jurisdiction in the former Indian Territory. So the fundamental weirdness of domestic dependent nations appears then, I think, not as a bug, but as a structural feature. American national identity is rooted in settler colonial nationalism, for instance, but also on its opposition, an appropriating claim to be indigenous. American practices of land taking rested upon force and power, and on the constant legal negotiation of Indian land title. Well, it's all about the land, of course. And so let me walk you through 5 distinct modes through which land passed out of Native hands. As Liza mentioned, I'm interested in sort of the periodization of American history. And this is one way of sort of thinking about that periodization through Native eyes and Native history. So Act 1 begins in the colonial era when land contracts, that is to say, a kind of economic frame that acknowledges Indian ownership through the form of the market, right, the contractual, and land treaties, which is to say a political practice that does the same through the mechanism not of the market, but of the state. When these things blur together in an initial set of nation-to-nation relationships. The spatial imaginary of this first mode of land loss is vast, right? It's continental in scope. This is a continental kind of imaginary you can see here, though it was executed at the local level. Rough balances of power, though uneven and shifting, are its reality. Diplomacy is its mode. Treaties are its form. And it extends through what one might otherwise call the colonial period into the first 2 decades of the early republic. A three-legged stool of federal policy frames the dynamics of a second mode. The Trade and Intercourse Acts made land transfer a federal matter, not a state or private matter. The Land Ordinance of 1785 created a grid structure that commodified the land and enabled its large-scale transfer into the public domain and then into the hands of the private sector. And the Northwest Ordinance laid out the terms under which a colony could become a state. This second mode was defined by Indian removal, compression, and containment. And the scope of spatial imaginary shifted explicitly from the continental to that of the region. In this case, the form of the would-be state, a colonial territory bidding to join the American empire. Doing so required 60,000 non-native settlers arranging themselves on the newly gridded landscape. American political development then required Indian people be removed, condensed, and confined. So periodize the second moment as a century, roughly, between 1787 and the addition of the Omnibus States of 1889. A third act. Now with Indian people confined to reservation spaces, Americans inaugurated a new strategy of land taking, neighborhood level dispossession. The reservation, collectively held, could be broken up into individual allotments, at which point the corrupt and sad triangulation of property, markets, and the individualization of that trust relationship all worked their magic. So Americans disaggregated reservation spaces and then desegregated them, interlacing non-native settlers into the resulting checkerboard and allowing them to extend claims over still more native land. Act 4. Now, eminent domain might describe each of these acts, but let's point more specifically to the upswing of reclamation-based eminent domain seizures in the early to mid 20th century, as well as sort of parks and forests and military kinds of bases. The Pick-Sloan Missouri River reclamation plans, which flooded thousands of acres of the best bottomlands on the Missouri reservations, offer the emblematic example. The 2016 Dakota Access Pipeline resistance at Standing Rock makes it clear that this mode continues today. The Indian Reorganization Act frames a fifth act beginning in 1934, featuring what we can think of as new modes of colonial management. This act, the IRA, had a decolonizing aspect, to be sure. It ended allotment. It created tribal government. It encouraged collective landholding. But these things were also accomplished or accompanied by a strong federal oversight that was, in effect, a kind of neo-imperial form of indirect rule. And it's hard to put an end date on this federal strategy, perhaps like eminent domain. There isn't one. We live today with the legacies of the IRA, which is a complicated piece of legacy. We can say that for certain. But if we were thinking about how it all ends, or how that ends, one might point, interestingly, to a 2-decade confluence marked by the re-emergence of arguments based on the Indigenous Constitution and of tribal nationalism taking new political shapes. So consider, for instance, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, which introduced the corporate form into Indian governance. The 1975 Indian Self-Determination Act, which encouraged tribes to contract for their own trust services. The 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, which led to severe budget cuts in Indian country, and a countermove to establish new forms of economic sovereignty, or the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which helped frame a new economic base, which tribes used to expand self-determination, social services, governance capacity, and new enterprises. These recent histories matter for today, even as we recall the massive land loss. Native tribal governments, those novel political forms, are as likely to be thinking about joint management agreements, shared jurisdiction, and strategies for gaining land back. And the last 50 years of tribal experimentation and capacity building constitute an under-recognized resource for rethinking social justice as it relates to political form. Despite ongoing and significant challenges, the vitality of Native America today is something to behold. It flies in the face of any narrative that suggests erasure or invisibility. So how might we reimagine a new American history that takes better account of such things as the Indigenous Constitution, the trust sovereignty paradox, or the 5 acts of American empire? It has been helpful to me to think with what the historian Elliott West once called greater reconstruction. Rather than see a north-south aligned nation being physically and socially reconstructed following the Civil War, West insisted that the analytical space of the US was continental. And he expanded the temporality of that thing we call reconstruction. Greater reconstruction, in West's terms, has 3 wars, not one, stretching from the Mexican-American War through Indian wars that ran into the 1880s. It was surely about the organizing of race and labor and land, but he marks its end not with the Compromise of 1877, but with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. What was being reconstructed, West argues, was continental attitudes about race writ large, including a lot of different kinds of racial formations and a lot of different kinds of people. And the mechanism for that reconstruction was the newly reorganized and empowered apparatus of the American state. Well, the argument has been a powerful and provocative one, and I want to pick it up as a model. Call it the greater X, where X is any standard narrative, event, or structuring device of US history, but now rethought to include American Indian people. The ideal form of greater isn't just additive, however. It pushes towards rethinking the conceptual categories in ways that transform the narrative. Let me stop sharing here for a minute. So any thought of greater reconstruction might point toward the greater Civil War, its continental politics laid bare by the amazing flood of legislation taking shape in 1862, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, the Pacific Railroad Act. These things made it clear that American development rested on a final snatching up of the Indian territory. Unsurprisingly, the 1860s saw this kind of land snatching, preceded by massive violence against American Indian people. The politics of plunder helped produce the Minnesota-Dakota uprisings in 1862 and immediate campaigns to ethnic cleanse the Northern Plains. The year 1863 saw the massacre of hundreds of Shoshone people at Bear River in Idaho. In the summer of 1864, the Navajo suffered under the death and removal of the Long Walk. A few months later, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were slaughtered at Sand Creek. California Indians suffered regular massacres, large and small. All this during what we can think of as the Greater Civil War, a continental conflict waged on multiple fronts with at least 2 linked objectives. It aimed not only to save the Union, the nation from the threat of disunion, but also to guarantee and to order its landed future through the use of force. And the Greater Civil War was in no way exceptional. Colonial and imperial wars often function as multipolar conflicts involving indigenous interests and armies. The 7 Years' War was, of course, the French and Indian War, the Greater Revolution, strategically structured by native alignments. And the official ending of both was no ending at all, for Indian alliances continued fighting. The Northwest Indian War required George Washington to devote 5/6 of the federal budget to the US military and crafted American national consolidation around a standing army. The Greater War of 1812 must account for Tecumseh's War and the Red Stick War. Between 1816 and 1858, the Seminoles waged 3 wars against the United States. Comanches fought from the 1820s until 1875. Lakotas fought until 1877 and didn't believe they were actually done until 1890. Apaches fought into the 1890s. Was there ever a moment in American history in which somewhere on this continent, the violence of what we can call the Greater Indian War was not taking place in one form or another? And this is not a story of episodic violence with a few landmark battles, but rather a long and continuous series of wars, often nested within other conflicts, and I think in too many narratives, often subsumed by them. Well, if we're working our way back from greater Reconstruction to the greater Civil War, then might we continue on to consider greater enslavement? Before any Europeans set foot in the Americas, this continent hosted a range of indigenous unfreedom, captivity, and enslavement. Slavery for labor, slavery for status, for sacrifice, temporary enslavement for the payment of debt, raiding and captivity for a trade in slaves, unfreedom as replacement for a dead relative, spiritual power to be found in the taming of a captive. Now add into that mix all the forms of unfreedom that Europeans brought with them: chattel slavery, convict labor, hostage slavery, indenture. The meeting of Native American, African, and European slave systems produced hybrid forms: the extreme violence of the slave raid systems of the South and the Spanish-inflected systems of the Great Plains and Great Basin. French slave trading circuits sourced Indian slaves from deep in the continent early on, and every English colonial war against Indians seems to have doubled as a slave raid. The 5 tribes embrace of chattel slavery in the South. When it came to Native people, these slaveries were also, it's worth noting, deeply gendered, putting a structural historical frame around the current crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, one would think that the 13th Amendment would have ended Indian slavery, but as Andres Resendez and Benjamin Madley have recounted, Indian slavery in New Mexico, California, and the Great Basin continued, in some cases, almost to the end of the 19th century. So North American slavery in that sense was indigenous, coming and going. And on both ends, it was genocidal in nature. In the early Spanish Caribbean, slavery was a mode of death dealing in and of itself. Starvation plus killing work, plus the denial of the reproduction of the population. And California enslavement followed similar patterns. So greater unfree North America then might be considered one of the most complex slave continents in the history of the planet. So to follow the frame of planetary history, we might also reject one of the great conceits of the historical profession: the boundary between history and prehistory in the Americas. Juliana Barr, who shows how centuries of history at Cahokia and Chaco are to be found in the subsequent historical record, has demonstrated one path into a greater North American history that pushes back at least 300 years before Columbus, and does so in historical terms. Now, in archaeological time, that's not much, but in historical time, it is worth noting it is longer than the entire history of the United States. If the greater X asks for expanded spatiality and temporality, then let us keep going to the greater peopling of the Americas itself. We've long been saddled with the old Clovis first theories of Bering Strait migrations around 13,000 years ago, linked to a weak correlation argument about the human-caused extinction of Pleistocene megafauna. And if we're not yet able to capture the full dimensions of a new story, we can at least sketch its edges. Genetic and archaeological evidence has now pushed human history here back past 20,000 years. A recent genetic modeling study floats an even longer time frame, 57,000 years in the past. These deep histories suggest complex human-climate relations, as in Australia, where people literally live through climate change. These are stories for the here and now. But the greater X need not function at such large scales. Consider, for example, a greater history of capitalism. The wealth generated out of Indian lands is no abstraction. Historians can do better than what we usually do, which is gesture to it in a token paragraph or 2 or maybe a few pages. For you can literally follow the money in an exercise of forensic accounting. And it leads directly to the initial 19th century capitalization of state finances, banks, corporations, and university endowments. Or the greater abolition movement. As Elise Portnoy has argued, the fight over the Indian Removal Act immediately preceded the radicalization of the anti-slavery movement of the 1830s. Anti-slavery reformers found themselves increasingly unable to justify their support for one policy, that is African colonization, that bore such strong similarities to another, that is Indian removal, which they strongly opposed. What about greater suffrage? Recenter Matilda Jocelyn Gage, whose capacious agenda for women's rights sprung out of her location in Haudenosaunee territory, her observations of indigenous women's rights, and her being gifted with a Haudenosaunee name. The Greater Progressive Era was full of Indian people, the Society of American Indians, modeled on the NAACP and hosting W.E.B. Du Bois as an honorary member, functioned as Native America's first think tank, kind of the first Indian Brookings Institute. It critiqued federal policy. It floated new ideas about citizenship and reform. It imagined new Indian futures. Greater Prohibition, perhaps. As Chris Clements has detailed, prohibition enforcement along the Canadian border had everything to do with indigenous space and with the growth of the New York State Police as an intrusive and oftentimes occupying force on those reservations. And reservations that functioned as jurisdictional black holes have meant that tribal lands have a long history of engagement with vice economies, far longer and more complicated than the picture of contemporary gaming that seems to frame most public discourse. When the Six Nations leader, Levi General Descahe, spent 18 months in Geneva in 1923 and 1924, he mobilized the political support of Ireland, Panama, Persia, Estonia, as well as the Netherlands and Japan, demanding that the League of Nations apply its kind of operational logic, that is justice for small nations, that they apply this to indigenous peoples. Though brutally crushed by Canada, Descahe's efforts marked long histories of greater indigenous internationalism, which carry forward the emergence of the word indigenous itself as a concept reliant upon the globalism of the United Nations. The Greater Cold War, perhaps, the termination of tribal collectivism under the termination policy, an early rejection of the New Deal order, an insistence on individual conformity to urban wage labor consumerism. All these things generated an Indian tribal rights movement that prefigured what we might think of as the greater 1960s. Or let's just shoot the moon. As David Wengrow and David Graeber point out, much to the outrage of some intellectual historians, it is possible to trace actual Indian people, the Wendat statesmen Kandirank in their case, to trace these people to generative critical dialogues with European thinkers in the years leading up to what we might then call the Greater Enlightenment. And so, yes, there are stories that can be told without the inclusion of Native people, but there are many, many more stories that needlessly erase Native presence. And let us not forget the rich Native histories that do not rely upon the markers of US history at all. So to actively combat processes of erasure, all of us who love history can look for transformative new understandings of once familiar themes and periods. I believe we can. Such has been the long-range project of African American history, which has modeled a full range of strategies, including one of the key engines for crafting new narratives, what we can think of as the speculative mode, which embraces the affect and emotion of fiction, the revealing possibilities of that thing called critical fabulation for readers of Saija Hartman, various forms of futurism, and even the historical counterfactual. And so following that lead, I want to narrate now a native-centric speculation taken up to return us to the implications of the Indigenous Constitution and to the question of political form. So in September 1778, in the midst of the War for Independence, the United States signed a treaty of alliance with the Delaware Nation, hoping to secure their military partnership in a planned assault on Detroit. The treaty guaranteed Delaware ownership of their lands and included this mostly forgotten but rather extraordinary promise found in Article 6. Once you make your way past the legal boilerplate at the beginning, you can see an invitation to join the present Confederation and to form a state whereof the Delaware Nation shall be the head and shall have a representation in Congress. Well, today we read this passage and maybe shake our heads. Just another example of American perfidy, a little quirky to be sure, but not really different in kind from any other broken treaty promise. But what if we imagined otherwise? So close your eyes and take yourself back to March 10th, 1781, the day on which the 14th state joined the Union. After fighting hard during the War for Independence, this new state had consolidated its political autonomy, devised rules for its governance, and sent delegates to the Continental Congress. I'm not talking about Vermont, but rather the new state of Lenape, populated by Indian people who paid taxes to the federal government and who would be counted when the Constitution came along with whole free persons and indentured servants, according to the 3/5 clause. Now, the road to America's first Indian state had been an improbable one, to be sure. In the fall of 1778, with the treaty freshly signed, American commander Lachlan McIntosh launched a failed expedition against Detroit, only to see the Delaware step in with a daring plan of winter warfare. Dragging McIntosh and his reluctant Americans behind them, a Delaware-led native army swept across Ohio and took the fort in March of 1779. The victory allowed the Delaware to expand the native alliance, and in July 1779, they swept across and captured Fort Niagara, freeing the imprisoned American officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Stacy, who demonstrated his gratitude by advocating for Delaware interests for the rest of his life, and in particular in the months and years to come. Delaware leaders working from their new base at Fort Niagara negotiated a Haudenosaunee withdrawal from the British alliance, and in the first months of 1780, the now substantial Indian Confederacy made its plans known to George Washington. They would protect the northern front from the British while mustering a significant force at the Princeton area farm of the Indian agent George Morgan. Washington could then press the British in the south with support along the Atlantic corridor from the Delaware. Now, this move to New Jersey was not coincidence, as the Delaware had young future leaders either enrolled at the College of New Jersey or preparing to do so, including the son of the Delaware leader White Eyes. This all falls within the sort of fact set of the counterfactual. These people were actually there. Things moved fast that fall. The British surrender in December, followed shortly after by the dramatic appearance of the Delaware leaders before Congress, where they pressed their case. They had effectively won the Western War. They had finalized American victory in the North, and they had supported the successful Southern campaign. They had established a confederation of tribes that wanted the promised statehood according to the articles of the treaty. They had nurtured leaders able to conduct the business of the state. Oh, and they had a powerful native army waiting in the wings. And under the United States Confederation model, the relative independence of an Indian state was not that dissimilar to the political claims of other states, which had diverse origins, social systems, and political interests. And so Lenape led the way in what would become the standard practice for the American empire, a refusal of the old charter land claims that mapped elongated megastates to the Mississippi, and instead a prefiguring of the process that would be laid out in the Northwest Ordinance. Well, Lenape was not large. The state's many enemies made sure of that. Still, the existence of Lenape, embattled but determined, shaped the subsequent course of American history, making possible the post-1812 state of Tecumseh, the hard-won peninsular state of Seminole, the incorporation of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an indigenous state, the Indian Territory state of Sequoia, the late-breaking southwestern states of Pueblo and Deneta, not to mention Alaska, of course, the indigenous-centric politics of the upper Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, and the semi-autonomous districts of Comanche and Lakota. Arguably, Lenape made possible the formal statehood of the United States 20th century imperial acquisitions, including Puerto Rico and the Pacific Confederated State. Without Lenape, those places might have lingered forever in an ambiguous territorial status. It surely shaped a new greater reconstruction as Lenape, Tecumseh, and Seminole developed tentative pre-war abolitionist sentiments into full-throated support of African-American political autonomy in the southern states, and the post-war carve-out of the Afrocentric state of Douglas from Indian Territory. The support of the indigenous states in the mid-20th century would help elevate the Black Belt thesis and the possibility of a Black state in the South. In the early 20th century, or the early 21st century rather, discussions of reparations for the legacy of slavery could not help but consider the political and territorial possibilities embodied by the indigenous states. So this did not happen. And here's why. On November 5th, 1778, with the ink on the treaty barely dry, an American militiaman shot and killed White Eyes. The Americans then lied to the Delaware, saying that he had died of smallpox. The Delaware splintered, most shifting their alliance to the British. In February 1782, a group of 150 starving Christian Delaware returned to their Ohio village at McNutt to collect stored food and crops left behind in the field. An American militia surrounded them, took a formal democratic vote as to whether to kill them or not, decided in the affirmative, and did so the next morning. The young Indian leaders left Princeton. Like his father, White Eye's son was casually killed for being an Indian. And so the state of Lenape was a contingent possibility in American history for about 47 days. Now, I started thinking about Lenape as a teaching tool, a device to get students to look closely at the sometimes surprising provisions found in treaties and to seek out Indian goals and negotiating strategies in documents that oftentimes keep those things hidden. It was a short step from there to think about other oddball political formations and their relation to the American Empire nation. Vermont, Texas, California, and Hawaii, Washington, D.C., the lost state of Franklin, the ghost state of Jefferson, various claims and arguments about secession, West Virginia, and the 1905 Indian Territory Convention that actually did propose the new state of Sequoia. And a deeply buried thread over a century long in which a handful of individuals did continuously advocate for Indian states. So such histories suggest a contingent quality to American political form and structure. We might do well to sort of revisit what we think was sort of determined from the outset. Now, some would point to Reconstruction as the moment when multiracial American democracy became a possibility and a goal. That is to say, like a civil rights narrative in which the Constitution and the Declaration are painfully but steadily brought closer to the realization of their highest ideals. Others might suggest the 1965 Immigration Act and an immigrant paradigm or narrative that assumes both assimilation and difference within a paradigm of liberal citizenship. The story of Lenape suggests a different possibility in which multiracial American democracy functions at the level of collective rights rather than individual ones, and has distinct origins both inside and outside the constitutional tradition. Indian people held tight to the sovereignty of the Indigenous Constitution, even as they were pulled into the jurisdiction and citizenship regimes of the American nation. And in the process, they created new structures for multiracial, multicultural, and indeed multi-sovereign American democracy. What the fantasy of Lenape asks from us is a recognition of the political status of federally recognized tribes today. Their place established by treaties very much like the 1778 Treaty of Fort Pitt. For don't we actually have 574 indigenous states of America right now? Semi-autonomous political entities with self-governance, dual citizenship, existing in structured relationships with other American states and with the federal government. Lenape's story seems insanely improbable, but I think it narrates us into thinking about political structures that actually do exist, and ones that might come to exist in a future such as ours, which is full of contingency, uncertainty, and danger. Well, as you can see, I like categories and lists. The 3 articles of the Indigenous Constitution, the 5 acts of American empire, the tally of greater X's, and by way of conclusion, the 5 things that Native people say. These are all heuristics, devices just to get us thinking. There are likely more than 3 articles and 5 acts, and Native folks obviously say more than 5 things. So please see these 5 things as a summary, the last in a series of little thought experiments. hooks on which to drape new stories and spurs to tell them. In this case, observations that are centered in a native or indigenous critique. So here's the list. Thing 1, we know you, but we've never understood you. Thing 2, we want our stuff back. Thing 3, we have a few things to say. Thing 4, we're not like the others. And thing 5, we're still here. So thing 1, we know you, but we've never understood you. From the first days of contact, Europeans wondered, can we understand these people? And they decided that they could. The Spanish held the first human rights debate, and they concluded that Indians were human beings, though the finding did not do much good. English and French philosophers figured that Indians were representative of an earlier moment in human development, and you could build compelling theories about property and governance on the backs of these pre-political people. So non-natives have been pretty confident in asserting knowledge about Indian folks, who they are and what they want. But over time, those thinkers and writers stopped wondering much about whether Indian people understood them. It didn't seem to matter a whole lot. So the first thing that Native people have said to non-Native people is this: we've seen enough to figure you out. We know to be cautious, but we don't really understand you. We don't understand why you love property and ownership so much. We don't understand your interest in elevating the individual above the collective. We don't understand why you separate out the category science from that of religion. We wonder why you measure time and history rather than being in place and space. We see that this is how you do things, but we are hard pressed to figure out why. And we're not saying these things in order to be critical. So please don't attach yourself to us in order to launch a critique of Western society. We are saying in a flat, a neutral, observational voice that your belief systems don't make sense to us, and you might not want to universalize them. Thing 2, we want our stuff back. So there's the taken land, and there's the wealth legacy of American capital, and there's the plunder of graves for racial science lifted from battlefields and interments sent to Philadelphia and Washington to have the skulls and the bones measured. There's the ethnographic and archaeological collecting that brought a flood of Native material culture pouring into American institutions. And so we want our stuff back. We want our ancestors to be put back to rest along with their traveling goods. Our sacred objects, we want them back for our own use. Those objects of cultural patrimony that belong to our collectivities, we want those back too. And while it seems unthinkable that the United States might actually return some of that land, in fact, there are new possibilities coming all the time. Outright returns, co-management of public domain lands, tribal purchase, private donation. It might not be so unthinkable after all. Thing 3, we have a few things to say. For a very long time, civilized intellectuals made fun of us. They made fun of our understandings of the world. They thought we were primitive, superstitious, animists, terrified of nature, ignorant. But listen to the way ecologists talk today. Soil is alive, they say. Forests are cooperative communities, with trees sharing resources, even across species. Trees communicate with one another through interconnected fungal networks. Fungi might even have languages. Animals and trees and plants, they know rather precisely what's going on in terms of water levels and nutrient flows and insect predators. Well, these are exactly the same kinds of things that Native people have been saying for a very long time. Because when you live in intimate relation with your environment for tens of thousands of years, you in fact create a science of observation, experiment, consolidation, and review. You pass that knowledge along. Your practice may function without labs and lasers, but may come to understand similarly deep things. Because if biologists start to sound like Indians these days, guess what? So too do theoretical physicists. And who knows where that might lead. Thing 4, we're not like the others, and that matters. Indians are written into the Constitution in order to be excluded from it. Indian people have a dual and simultaneous claim on their own retained sovereignty and as people with a trust relationship claim on the United States. And these two things help constitute us as tribal nations with formal political relationships with the United States, not a racial group so much as a political one. And yet, Indian people have been and are racialized, and perhaps those histories offer a new way into contemporary discussions that have been perhaps overstructured by the already and now tiresome label critical race theory. From an indigenous point of view, multiracial democracy began with collective rights, not individual ones. And since tribal national life is flourishing, if confronting many challenges, might it not be an alternative way to think about new strategies for racial reconciliation and even new political structures within a pluralistic nation? Thing 5, we're still here. In the 1950s and 60s, the United States tried to shut down American Indian tribal governments, but they came roaring back in the decades after, bolstered by a new commitment to upholding the treaties. And Native American demography, starting from a low point around 1900, when about 250,000 Indian people appeared in the census data, this has done nothing but increase. Today, the Census Bureau reports 9.7 million Native people. That's both alone and in combination. It's about 2.9% of the US population. And despite all the weirdness of self-declaration, tribal enrollment, and the census itself, it's not just that we're still here, it's that we're growing. And yet, we're still here, get said, because it needs to be. Because despite the gains, the settler colonial theory, the prediction of indigenous erasure, continues to hold. I have sometimes wondered as I'm thinking through these things, whether I'm saying anything new at all, whether all this sounds familiar to me because I've been thinking about it, or because it's just the same old, same old. But then I remember, it feels familiar to me because people in my family have literally been saying the same thing for 4 generations. And that to me is evidence of the assertion that this erasure is in fact structural, requiring the continuous repetition of we're still here. And sometimes we're still here is as much for Native people as it is for other folks. Speaking of survival is actually a mechanism for pursuing survival, or better, pursuing that unique quality that the Anishinaabe writer Gerald Visner once called survivance. Not just survival, not just resistance, but a sense of courage, life, dignity, autonomy, legacy, wise engagement, resilience and caring, and affirming humor in the face of disasters that might otherwise have produced only cynical irony. A good thing for us to try to escape at this moment. And in this moment of history wars and hot wars, of disintegrating democracy and racial contest and realignment, climate disaster and capital-induced paralysis, aren't those lessons of indigenous survivance well worth learning? And so recall, if you would, the request made by those folks at the Reclaiming Native Truth report, a full tilt effort at large-scale culture change taken up on the field of narrative and story, told by Native artists, writers, and scholars, to be sure, but also by everyone else. And that everyone else has to include us, those of us who care about and are interested in the study of the past. For aren't these lessons and evocations and possibilities best learned through the practice of history? And most particularly, through the American histories told and taught by those of us invested in the places where we're at. Places like Indiana, literally named after Indian people, right? And yet navigating the histories that displaced those same people from that state. I think the answer to this question is yes, we actually do have to engage these things. It's a good thing for us to do. And so I wish you all the best as you take up this mission on your own terms in your own engagements with a complex, shared, challenging, but ultimately fascinating past of American history. Thank you all so much.
That was wonderful, Phil. Thank you.
Thanks, Liza.
Wow. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. I'm sure I'm not the only one who loved it. So we have lots of people here. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. The Q&A is open. We're going to give Professor Deloria just a second to, get a drink of water, situate himself a little bit. But please, put your questions in the Q&A. He can see them, I can see them. He'll be taking questions. And I would love to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind. Should we start with a really basic, easy question, or jump right into things? We'll start nice and slow. So I thought you offered so many ideas, so many great ideas are here. Where do you see this going? Where are you going with this work?
Yeah. So so my intent on this, right, is a book of essays, basically, is a collection of essays, and sort of modeled on some of the sort of short books of essays, of memoir-ish kind of reflections, I think, that we've seen a lot of folks write, to good advantage over the last few years, right? Something that is accessible, that is public facing, that, I'm hoping that things like the Lenape counterfactual are fun and quirky enough, right, that people grab onto them. I'm hoping that things like the Indigenous Constitution are sort of useful ways of thinking, getting us thinking about our own constitutional, kind of traditions and how we make sense of those kinds of things. So one of the things that I really want to pull out of, kind of that whole list of the greater X's is the question of greater enslavement. And you can tell I spoke a little bit longer about that. I just think this is such an important question for us to think about how we grapple with the really, really complicated histories of enslavement and in ways in which sort of African descended people and Native people can sort of see clear to kind of, have a conversation in which, we can do honor to the historical experiences, of those groups, and not just to those groups, right? Because when we think about Asian American folks being caught up in indentured labor kinds of things, right, that are on the edge of sort of enslavement or unfreedom, we think about, Latinx or Hispanic folks, doing the same thing. So this question of unfreedom, I think, is a really important one, in American history. So I'm projecting it as sort of 4 or 5 essays in a smallish kind of form that's, kind of really accessible and is, I don't want to say fun. This stuff is not necessarily fun, but I think it is interesting and thought-provoking. And of course, as you know, right, there's a forward-facing argument here, which is that, Native American tribal government forms are oftentimes sort of seen as being marginal and unimportant and weird. But in fact, if we're really thinking hard about the ways in which our American political system is configured, it might be a really great place to sort of think productively towards the future. So I really want to make that kind of argument, as well.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'll ask one more question and then we'll jump into the Q&A. And please, everybody, feel free to put your questions there. We'd love to hear from you. I'm really fascinated by this question of historical periodization and this strategy that you're using of changing this language of using, using this term greater. Is periodization possibly a thing of the past? And are historians today more concerned with themes like colonialism or capitalism or racialization than they are with debating historical periods, which has been kind of our bread and butter up until now? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Liza, this is a great question. I mean, there is a kind of case that American historians are really sort of like have turned to thematic things, and that we've accepted certain kinds of periodizations as being useful. For example, I mean, when we teach the U.S. History Survey, we split it somewhere around the Civil War, and I mean, we're all supposed to teach through Reconstruction, and we never quite get there, and then we start up kind of post-Reconstruction, and we never actually do that period, very well. So there's a periodization that works. I mean, in Native American history, there's been periodizations that have basically been based on federal policy. My periodizations here actually line up somewhat with that, but they're actually, the logic of them is not a policy. It is a policy logic, and it's not a policy logic. It's really a logic about sort of land, how much land and how Native land is held, and how Native land is sort of taken, or kind of moved out of Native hands. So in my own sense, I have found that kind of exercise of periodization not simply leading to a slicing and dicing of chronological kinds of things, but actually a productive, kind of way of thinking through certain kinds of logics. And so this has been part of the critique of Elliott West's Greater Reconstruction, right? Is that, like, by expanding this thing, to encompass the, Mexican-American War and to, up to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and even later, right, one might argue, that he sort of like lifted the logic out of Reconstruction itself, right? And sort of like the question is the analytical payoff worth the analytical cost? And I think Elliott West would say it is, because he would say, like, I'm giving us something new to think about, an exercise in periodization that actually shifts our conceptual framework or conceptual landscape. So it does seem to me that like periodization is not necessarily dead. I think it comes and goes. I found it useful to kind of continue to sort of engage that. And in fact, I challenge my students to sort of invent new periodizations, which is always a fun exercise, another one of these sort of counterfactuals. So I say yes to that.
Thank you. Well, we've got several questions here. I don't know which you would like to start with.
Yeah, wow, there's a ton of questions.
Yeah,
I mean, do you think that, I'll just read the question, do you think that beyond giving a sense of social coherence, do such narrative politics act both to police the validity and invalidity of historical narratives and the determination of what historical narratives get popularly disseminated? And the answer to that is a definitive yes. I think there's sort of, six sort of master narratives, a term that we, used to use and maybe don't use quite as much. I mean, these sort of six compelling kind of narratives, and we all know what they are: the frontier, the city on the hill, the founding fathers, the Civil War, these kinds of things. Those things are sort of elevated to make certain kinds of arguments, right? And as they're elevated, they can't help but have the effect of sort of sublimating other kinds of narratives. The piece of the narrative politics that's been most interesting to me has been, kind of the emergence of two different forms, multiple forms, right? But at least two large kinds of forms of African-American narrative. The first, sort of the story of slavery to freedom to civil rights, which is a progressive narrative that plays into, I think, many of the same kind of tropes that we see in the other narratives. It's an affirming kind of narrative about the possibilities of bringing the Declaration and the Constitution, into some kind of alignment. And that narrative, I think, has been easily absorbed into sort of our teaching, our textbook writing, these kinds of things. It sits alongside a much more radical African-American narrative, right, around abolition, that might step around that Black nationalism, that might sit outside of that sort of narrative, which has been very, very convenient narrative, for sort of, kind of a genial liberalism, right? Those kinds of things. So when I'm thinking about narrative politics, it's exactly about sort of the ways in which these stories kind of align with one another, they braid together, and the ways in which sometimes they challenge each other. And then I think the ways in which we can imagine, how does this native story fit into these things? Because it kind of doesn't. It wants to step outside of all of those sort of traditions. And I wonder about the ways then that native narrative, however we end up framing it, right, can find other kinds of alliances with some of these other stories which have been sublimated, and can we tell a different kind of story? But one that I want to sort of emphasize, one that is engaged with the larger picture of American history, right? So I'm not really seeking to, it's a separatist kind of political structure, but I'm actually not seeking to tell a separatist story. I want to tell stories that are sort of resonant across those things.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've got several more. The first one is sort of a global question.
Yeah, could you talk more about the historical internationalization of Indigenous political action? How can we think about the connections past and present on participation of Indigenous people in global discussions? I think this is a great question, and thank you so much for it. I mean, it's important for me to sort of, kind of see that there is a longer history of Indigenous international kind of encounter, for sure, that at least stretches back into the late 19th and early 20th century in the kind of classic forms of things like the League of Nations, for example. But it does feel also to me like much of the energy around this is a kind of post-World War II sort of historical kind of, to speak of periodizations, right, Liza? And some part of that is sort of, global international Indigenous organizing and conversations, right? What happens when Aboriginal Australian folks, right, come to the United States, and who are they talking to? What happens when, folks who are interested in language reclamation go and study with Maori folks who are doing first language teaching? What happens when Sami folks and, folks from Taiwan actually start talking to each other, right? So there's an Indigenous circuit that's kind of formed, in the post-war period around questions about decolonization and things like that. And then there's another circuit that I think is formed in relation to the International Labor Organization, to the United Nations, that ends up, producing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. and where the structuring form of that is that thing called the United Nations, right? And arguably it's where the word indigenous really kind of takes on its resonance and currency, right? Is in that international, kind of setting. And this is where the question about sort of, what are indigenous rights? How are they to be enforced in relation to these nation states that just don't really want to respect them at all? So much of that comes down to questions about sustainability, survival, subsistence, climate, environmental kinds of things, right? I mean, this ends up, I think, much of UNDRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, has to do with cultural patrimony, has to do with holding on to your kids, has to do with all of the stuff. It's a litany of bad stuff that's happened and saying we're not going to do it anymore. But I think what's really sort of been emergent then out of that over the last, X number of decades has been, environmental questions and climate questions. And now, I mean, of course, these things have like nothing but urgency, to them, because we know indigenous people are bearing the brunt, right, of climate change, across the Pacific and many, many, other places. And so the question about sort of how this gets organized, going forward, what kinds of capacities we can draw upon from those indigenous sort of networks, how the UN does or does not actually function in a useful kind of way. These are obviously the questions that are kind of determine the future for a very large number of people.
Thank you. Very powerful answer. Thank you.
In order, and I see Stephen
Okay.
is sort of next. So your
Okay.
counterfactual seems to assume that removal and the Trail of Tears would have happened even if Lenape had come into existence. Yeah, I mean, Stephen, this is exactly a very smart observation, right? I think if you're really carrying out the counterfactual, and taking certain kinds of assumptions and sort of laying them as groundwork, you really do, it would require a wholesale sort of rewriting, of all kinds of histories, which, I wasn't quite prepared to do. And so you sort of leaving things like removal and Indian territory, right, as it stands, is probably, kind of a fly in the ointment, right, in the, in the counterfactual, right? Because I mean, one of the things that's so interesting then about Indian territory, I mean, I got to say, like, I've been pushing so many students to the study of Oklahoma, which just strikes me as one of the most interesting, complicated, and oddest places, in the country in so many different ways. I think if you could understand Oklahoma, you could understand so much about the United States. And I have to confess, like, I don't understand it, like I could see, so, but I think this is right. And for me, sort of like, it might be really fun to sort of sit down a little longer with this counterfactual and sort of track out, like, what would that have looked like? Like, what would non-removal have looked like in the South? I tossed the state of Seminole in because that actually has certain kinds of areas of plausibility to it. But it does sort of beg the question about what the South would have looked like and what the 5 tribes would have looked like. Would they have continued as slaveholding, kinds of entities? There's no reason to think that they wouldn't have, right? What would the place we now call Indian territory look like with, really quite powerful native folks there? What would the Midwest have looked like? You think about places like, Ottawa County, in Oklahoma, which, I think 8 tribes, Midwestern removal tribes, but also, tribes in California, right? I mean, so there's all kinds of stuff, of course, that go a little crazy and go a little haywire in that. And Stephen, I do appreciate your question.
Speaking of the Seminole, we have a question about Seminole, looks like.
Yeah, could you discuss or name names of those non-Indigenous who wanted to form native states, like Seminole, and the arguments wishing for war and genocide instead of peaceful, coexistence? Our nation would have been different. I mean, so, there's folks who are coming out of the sort of missionaries in the Southeast sort of tradition. I'm going to blank on this guy's name. Jeremiah Everts, right? Who is a sort of, big proponent in the moments of removal for, for sort of native, the possibility of a native state. The post-Civil War treaties, that are signed with those tribes that are in Indian territory, also sort of hold out the possibility of a state. I sometimes have my students read the 1905 Sequoia Convention, documents, which are absolutely fascinating. And, these folks know that they're up against it, that it's not likely to happen, but they also feel like they have a legal treaty-based kind of claim to a state, right? That it's actually been promised to them. And they completely think that it may be possible, not an easy lift, but not impossible, either. So you've got that kind of thread. And it's interesting to me, following that 1905, sort of Sequoia Convention, Annie Abel, the sort of Oklahoma historian, said, I'm going to figure this out. And she actually wrote a kind of definitive article that traces back, a number of people who had been advocating for native states, so she's when I say there's a long thread, she's the author of that thread. And, it's a pretty interesting kind of piece from the American Historical Review in like 1907, right? So this stuff is around there a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. I can read the next question if you want to rest your voice for just a second.
Sure.
Take a glass of water. So Judith Allen, our distinguished professor of history in our department, asked also about periodization. She said, can I continue Liza's question on periodization? Instability is arguably a wider crisis across comparative historiographies. Examples, the long 19th century, or which war, post-war, and the 1,000 years called the Middle Ages. The middle of what? 2 exclamation points and 2 question marks. I remember interesting conversations with Christina Schneider about ancient American history instead of prehistory. So, uppercase, or all caps, my question is about the how of Indigenous histories establishing valuable chronologies for our own histories. In my own country, Australia, Aboriginal peoples crash linear and speak of history as a book, openable at any page at choice.
Yeah, Judith, thanks for the question. It was also great to see you this weekend. Thank you for coming to the OAH. Yeah, it feels to me like there's a couple of ways into this. One way is to sort of say like, okay, what are Indigenous epistemological kind of positions on history, and how do those things actually work and function, right? And so this becomes sort of, epistemological challenges to sort of Western knowledge production. I don't tend to sort of like, it's hard to sort of figure this out, right? Because oftentimes what I take to be pretty different sets of claims and possibilities tend to get mushed together into like an Indigenous generalization, right? Native people have cyclical histories and cyclical versions of time. And, I just, this is a place where the sort of generalization argument just doesn't really fly so much for me. It feels to me like there's a lot of distinct kinds of things. I've tried to get my head around, Australian Aboriginal sort of senses of time and history, and it feels very different to me than it does, with some the North American traditions, I know the best. So one way to think about it is there's Indigenous epistemological things which, cause us to question history and might be taken as the occasion for sort of different kinds of narrations. The second thing, though, I think, is to sort of like lean in to sort of the questions about history and time and linearity. I don't necessarily believe that Native folks don't think in a linear kind of, sort of way. A lot of times, people like that winter camp that I had up there for a while, people a lot of times would look at that and they're like, oh, this is evidence that Native people are thinking in cyclical ways. I'm like, no, it's actually just a line that is arranged in a spiral, right? And in fact, I think Native people think in really, really complicated ways, around these kinds of historicities. So in any case, I don't know that there may be a case, I'm sorry, I'm babbling here, Judith. There may be a case for sort of rejecting these things, but there's also a case for leaning into the timelines. And I think this is where sort of archaeology becomes a really, really interesting kind of point of cross-disciplinary engagement with history. What does it mean to sort of imagine that there's an Indian classical history of this continent? The partnership between archaeology and in the field of classics is, a really good one. And why would we not imagine that same kind of partnership, in a narration of a broader North American history that goes back, maybe not infinitely, but let's just start going back by 300 years. If we go back to Chaco and Cahokia, those are two landmark kinds of things. When we think about the Northern Plains and the Mandan folks and things like that, it's entirely possible for us to imagine reconstructing, a history that drops back 300 or 400 years. This does not seem, and to narrate it, as well. So this seems within the realm of possibility. And I think we should, make it our next project. And really, in doing so, kind of really destroy that, that line. I mean, I'll tell you, in a book that, like, I think really made an early effort to sort of take this on was Colin Calloway's book, One Vast Winter Count, which is a book that sort of dropped out of our consciousness, but I think it's well worth going back and revisiting, because he's trying to push back a little bit, and he didn't have a lot of the archaeological stuff that we now have, so I think there's interesting things to happen on this particular, kind of front.
Thank you. Well, from archaeology to blood quantum, we have a question from Chris Manydeeds. Asking, can you talk about the artificial limitation on sovereignty on tribes by limiting who can join, and blood quantum? And then Chris added a few more questions. Can you expound on the tension between states and tribes? How are they characterized? Yeah. Oh, and there's even more from Chris down below, but we'll take these two.
Chris is just keep going. How does the characterization of Native tribes as living only in the 1890s affect current relations with tribes to films? Yeah, Chris, these are three really interesting and really good and quite different, sorts of questions. I mean, the blood quantum thing is super complicated. There's just no doubt about it, right? And if we sort of say, look, tribes are sovereign nations who are going to have the power to determine their own membership, and if they choose to use blood quantum, it is true that blood quantum is a vanishing kind of practice, that is colonial in nature. Native folks outmarry more than any other population. If you take blood quantum seriously, you inevitably see the population of tribal peoples kind of nosedive, right? So there's a problem. On the other hand, as Kim Tallbear has argued, I think quite compellingly, how do we sort of think kinship in a contemporary world? And, she makes I think, quite subtle argument that one way to think about it, not wholly and absolutely and crudely, but subtly, is that blood quantum can be, in some cases, proxy, right, for kinship. So this is an interesting kind of claim to me. But this feels like a completely unfinished sort of conversation, right? I mean, I think it's a conversation that 15 years ago we thought was kind of done, and then we realized, like, it's absolutely not done at all. And so you've got all kinds of things happening. I mean, tribes doing disenrollment. There's the sort of famous consultant study that for Ojibwe folks at White Earth, where they laid out 5 or 6 different scenarios. What would it look like to sort of say blood quantum only from White Earth, blood quantum that is Anishinaabe writ large, blood quantum that shifts from 1/4 to 1/8, blood, I mean, all of these different kinds of calculuses, and different tribes, as we know, across the country have different sort of ways of solving that problem, so it's not, it's not an easy thing, I don't think. Tension between states and tribes, it's, I mean, from the very beginning, right? States have never really been the friend of tribes. I think we can say this pretty definitively. I mean, one of the arguments I want to make in this book is I sort of gestured to the militia, and I've got a much longer sort of riff about the militia as a sort of arm of not the federal state, but the state, and the militia as a kind of epistemic American social form, right? Of, and I'm not talking about my militia here in Arlington, Massachusetts, right, where you get these guys with tri-corner hats that fight off the British. I'm talking about, like, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, these militias, which are, kind of authorized by the state as basically, sort of Indian killing social organizations, right, to sort of, protect the frontiers, but also to sort of advance fighting a defensive conquest of their, of their territories. I mean, so we saw this during COVID, right? I mean, we saw in South Dakota, right, where, Lakota people were, saying, like, we're going to run an effective quarantine, and we're going to blockade our roads, and you're not welcome here. And, the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, kind of like saying, oh yeah, right? I mean, so the conflictual stuff that happens, with states all the time. And I think it's because within the structure, right, if we think federal, state, local, tribal is actually much closer to state. Right. And the antagonisms, right. I mean, it's not that there's not antagonisms at the local level, God knows there are, but the antagonisms at the state level are the ones that can, I think, become the most acute and kind of dangerous sometimes. Yeah, I know, tribes and films. Chris, I might let Liza answer that one because she's our expert on really, kind of films and tribes. I mean, I'll just say, one of the great things over the last few decades, right, has been the sort of emergence and the seizing of control of the mechanisms of visual production by Native people. And I think it, in the 70s, you can see how Native folks got involved in documentary filmmaking, right, an accessible, low budget kind of way of, kind of jumping into that. And then, as now we've got, YouTubes and TikToks and Instagrams and all these kinds of things, right, social media kinds of films, right, Native people, started owning the short film, right? I mean, you think about, 1491s, these kinds of things like the massive production, low budget, funny, cool, things that can actually generate lots and lots of viewing and can actually, call attention to sort of Native issues and do lots of Native work. I mean, and upon that, then what gets built, right? Music videos, Native hip hop, all kinds of Native stuff. And then, right, those few feature films, and now you've got, Rutherford Falls and Reservation Dogs and, all these other kinds of things, So, and as we know, almost all of those and these new contemporary things aren't both making fun of the 1890 thing and insisting on contemporary, kinds of visual, and, kind of visual politics. So, I mean, to me, this has been a fabulous and fascinating thing to watch. And again, Liza is really the expert here, but, yeah, that's my take on it.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. And you certainly wrote about film and Indians in unexpected places. So you are truly an expert. Well, we've gone a bit over time. I thank you for not cutting us off right away, but we have gone a bit over time. And I think that we're all very, very appreciative of the many, many great ideas you've shared with us and your generosity in this Q&A. It's been such an honor. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's been my great pleasure. Liza, thank you for being in conversation with me. It's always fun to see you. Liza and I were colleagues, early on at the University of Michigan, and it's always a joy for me to be, with you in the same space. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's always a joy to see you, and you've been an awesome mentor to me. I want to say that if I can just squeeze it in really quick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil and Liza, and thank you really to the audience, your great questions. The enthusiasm that's projected in some of the comments. So thanks to all, and we will see you down the road. Take care.